I feel very strongly that everyone needs to be allowed into this conversation. This conversation needs to be accessible to everybody. It's not just for serious academics or serious journalists. Everybody needs to understand what's happening in the world because it really does affect everything and everyone.
We're trying to inform people about the kind of the mass movement that we really need against this war drive. And so in that sense, you have to bring, like you say, a lot of humanity and positivity to that.
Hi, welcome to Global Majority for Peace. I'm Ileana Chan, and my co-host is Fiona Edwards. This week, we're doing something a little different. It is our 1 year anniversary. I mean, at least it's our 1 year anniversary in terms of starting this podcast, doing the graphics, getting everything together. But we posted our first ever episode in the middle of July. But we would like to use June as a month to really fundraise for our coming costs. Basically, just to cover our costs for the coming year. We've estimated that it takes £7,000 to do our podcast for a year. So that's our goal for the month. Hopefully, you can help us. We have different options for donating. Patreon, where, if you just want to do something like $3 a month, you could easily just do that and become a patron on our Patreon. We also have Buy Me a Coffee if you want to do a one-time donation. And we also do have a GoFundMe. So, take your pick. And if none of those are possible, then, sharing, commenting, liking, just interacting with our content and following our social media really helps. So thank you in advance. So what are we going to be talking about this week, Fiona? We're just going to be looking over the year, doing a little bit review, what we learned, what was surprising, just sort of fun stuff about what we've covered this year. So maybe you could actually explain what our mission is with this podcast and why we started it.
Absolutely. Well, I think to begin with, we're both coming from various movements. You were involved in the campaign to free Julian Assange. I was involved in the campaign against the New Cold War, which I was a co-founder of. I've been involved in the anti-war movement, the Palestine Solidarity movement, and the peace movement for over a decade and a half. And basically, we wanted to kind of put forward more voices from the global south and from the anti-war movement, because really what we're seeing in the global north, which continues actually a year on from our podcast launch, was a huge war drive against Russia, China, and countries in the global south. We're seeing record numbers spent on military spending in the US and Europe, and that's only a trajectory that has increased over the last year. And this is like leading to not just a Cold War, but actually hot wars within that, and the threat actually of a third world war. So, in the West, in the global north, you can really feel like there's just one perspective, which is, demonization of the countries that the United States has sort of seeking to suppress and to dominate. And there's all loads of propaganda on why these countries are terrible and need to be, basically justifying a war narrative. And so we really thought it was very important to kind of burst the bubble, because it's not the case that this one perspective exists in the world. Obviously, it's reinforced by a very powerful, well-financed media in the global north, which has huge global impact, not just in the global north, but everywhere. But actually, there's movements, there's politicians, there's organizations all over the world, the global north and particularly the global south, that are against this agenda of warmongering and have a completely different perspective, a perspective which is based on sovereignty, to get an agenda actually internationally of cooperation. So kind of that's where the starting point was, which like we want to not have a new Cold War, not have this war drive, and see the resources that are being wasted on that redirected, and to kind of give our audience the perspectives that there really are. It's not just some sort of fantasy perspective. This is something that millions, if not billions of people across the world consciously believe in. And so we just thought it would be really important to get a voice on independent media, a new channel, Empire Watch. You're watching it right now, so you know that. And so that was kind of the original purpose of why we did what we did.
Yeah, and that's why we called it Global Majority for Peace, because we genuinely believe it is the global majority that wants peace. And if we can frame and sort of like highlight what the US empire does and how it shapes the world in terms of this war drive, I think people who consume Western media can kind of understand where peace needs to be promoted from. Like, we cannot really address peace or grow a movement for peace without acknowledging that US empire is leading the war drive. And I think that often happens like in the Western media. So that's why we started this podcast. It's a little bit of a different line than a lot of things you see in Western media, but we also have spoken to some really great academics, intellectuals, political commentators around the world that share a similar line.
Yeah, like, there is definitely the case like in the Western media, it's like the role of the US is completely eliminated as playing any aggressive role, right? So that's one issue, is just even being like the US is playing an aggressive role. But there's also like false equivalencies that we see as well, where you have, oh, China is just as aggressive as the United States. And that really doesn't ring true when you look how many military bases the United States has compared to China, who's sailing warships against who. So
Mm.
we've been really clear about that this is something which it's the United States that is playing such a destabilizing role. And that's something which doesn't get any coverage in the mainstream at all. So I think that's been a really important angle. And it definitely goes against like the kind of billionaire finance position, essentially.
Yeah, it's not an inter-imperialist rivalry that we're currently suffering under. The US has almost 1,000 foreign military bases, and China has one. So that, that's a clear difference between the two countries. And so I think it is really important for us to like talk to people who understand that and understand the intricacies within that framework because, every single country outside of the West as well is affected by the US Wardrive. And especially when we're looking at the South China Sea and the escalation that's happening there, each country in that region has to negotiate between not wanting to be the next Ukraine. I mean, that's controversial and just sort of sensationalist, but the next proxy of the US. Every country has to sort of weigh those forces because everybody does want to trade with China. I mean, essentially. So that's what we've been kind of talking about this year. And I think like our biggest topics of conversation have been aligned with with what's happening with China, instigated by the US. But should we go a little bit into how did we meet?
Yeah,
Um,
definitely. You should kick this one off, Ileana, I think.
okay, so how we met was it was COVID. I had my first ever podcast, and I wanted to talk to somebody in the UK about China. Basically, I was just hoping that I just moved from LA to London, and I was hoping that I could find someone to talk about in terms of China because I was seeing so much anti-China propaganda, especially from the US, but even here in London. And I was introduced to Fiona, who is, like we mentioned, the co-founder for No Cold War. And I was quite surprised and shocked that it was a lovely English lady. Sorry. Who talked to me and it actually educated me a little bit on the No Cold War line on China, etc. And so I interviewed her. My fourth ever episode as an interviewer, I interviewed you, and that's how we met. And the rest is history, or rather. And then after that, we decided why not actually do a podcast together since we have like very aligned politics in terms of anti-China propaganda and anti-war, anti-imperialist sort of ideologies. And yeah, and Global Majority for Peace was born, basically. So that's how we met, and that's how we got here. And now we are 34 episodes in, which are you surprised that we've gotten this many episodes?
No, I mean, I think we're doing really well, and it's been great to make all those connections across the world. And there's no kind of lack of voices, really. I think that's what's been really inspiring. But also, I think the other thing that's been really key is that, as well as having voices from the global south, genuine global south voices, we've had a lot of women on the podcast too, which I think is refreshing because often, you have even within anti-imperialist spaces that are really progressive, just very male dominated kind of panels and stuff. And I think that doesn't really reflect the kind of global majority for peace. Because if you're talking about a global majority, you have to definitely include within who are the majority of the majority. So I think that's been really key in our journey as well.
Have there been any sort of surprises when you look back over the year for you?
I don't know about surprises. I mean, what about you? Have you been surprised by anything?
I guess maybe not surprised, but there is a few things that might be a little bit not so much controversial, but sort of shaped the way that I'm approaching the podcast. One of the things that came up in Carl Za's episode. Kalza is the host of the podcast Silk and Steel. He talks about Chinese history, Chinese culture, and he's a political commentator that is based in Bali, but he's also American, or he grew up in America, but was born in China. So he approaches it very much from a personal perspective of having lived in China before it opened up, and also having lived in the US through all the Iraq War and understanding imperialism and stuff from that perspective.
They don't want to have to choose between United States and China. If you listen to the former Singaporean diplomat Kishore Mobani, he has said again and again, we don't want to be forced to choose between United States and China. What he's really saying is, if you keep on pushing us, we're going to have to choose China because Southeast Asia, their economic destiny is already tied to the rise of China.
But one of the things is, as we were talking, we have both been accused of laughing too much as we talk about very, very serious topics. And so that is something that I think comes up because this is a podcast about very serious topics. And I think when people have commented that to me, which I understand definitely, it's been like, why are you guys laughing? This is so serious. And my take on this has always been, I am not actually a serious journalist, believe it or not, but I'm a human being that is deeply worried and concerned about this escalation towards war. And imperialism affects everybody's daily life. So we are not allowed to laugh about how ridiculous the anti-China propaganda is. If we're not allowed to laugh when we're talking about these topics every single day, every moment of the day, sometimes in every conversation, sometimes, then, we're never allowed to laugh. I mean, so there's that aspect of it, but then there's also the other aspect of it of I feel very strongly that everyone needs to be allowed into this conversation. This conversation needs to be accessible to everybody. It's not just for serious academics or serious journalists. Everybody needs to understand what's happening in the world because it really does affect everything and everyone. And so that's my perspective on it. But obviously, people disagree, and that's understandable. But yeah, so that's like something that came up a lot, which maybe is not surprising, understandable, but interesting to navigate for me. Because, like I said, I don't see myself as a serious journalist. How do you feel about yourself positioning yourself as a podcaster slash journalist slash movement organizer, co-founder? Like, how do you define yourself and approach this?
Okay, a heavy way in there, Ileana. So you're asking me if I'm serious. Well, I think I may be the serious one. If you're the more fluffy one, maybe. I don't know. I think it's very serious topics, like, as you mentioned, my background in journalism and political campaigning. But I think it is important that we're bringing on guests that are experts, but not just, academics. We have got, people that are leaders of political forces and campaigns. But the whole point is we're trying to inform people about the kind of the mass movement that we really need against this war drive. And so in that sense, you have to bring, like you say, a lot of humanity and positivity to that, because I think the key thing is, when you're looking at the news, you can just feel it's a lot of like doom, doom, doom. Things are getting bad. You've got this war drive, which is really taking money out of our public services. Wages have been stagnant. It's a really hard time for people. So I think it's important to be like, well, why are we doing this? It's actually because we're pro-humanity. We want people to have a good life. So I think it is important to kind of bring that kind of realness to things. And also, like you say, some of the lies that we have to debunk, it's hard to take it seriously. So I think it is important to bring that kind of humor to some of the stories. We've all, of course, had many a headline in the West coordinated, really, which is, China's, eliminated poverty, but at what cost, and other things like that, which it's almost like satirical in themselves. I don't know if I answered your question, but I guess I come from a more serious background. This is a serious issue. I'm not saying you didn't come from a serious background. You've just said that yourself. So you made a weird, a weird choice there.
I did.
But yeah, so I don't know if that helps.
Levity sprinkled through serious topics. I mean, I think that's kind of my idea. And also, the fact of the matter is that when we focus more on China and we actually understand that genuinely the depth of optimism that is in China, You can afford to laugh when you're talking about, I think, topics that are connected to China, even while this like war escalation led by the US against China is a very serious matter. The fact is, Chinese people in China are extremely optimistic about their chances. They're extremely optimistic about their lives and the progress that their country has made. And also that region, like Asia in general, I mean, like Southeast Asia, Asia in general, a lot of those areas that have strengthening ties with China have reason to be optimistic. They're seeing a change in the world, like a world where the global south is rising, where multipolarity really feels almost inevitable in that region. So when we look at the progress of China and what it can really do for the rest of the world, there's a lot of reason to have levity and there's a lot of reason to have optimism. When we only look at the West, then yeah, there isn't that much to laugh about, I suppose. We could put it that way. So, speaking about that, we've had some really amazing guests that have talked about China, that are experts on China, that live in China, to name a few. Our second ever episode was with the Chinese journalist and host of Talk It Out with Li Jingjing. Li Jingjing. She was on twice. So she was on our second episode and she was on, oh, I can't even remember now, one of our episodes um, pretty recently to talk about the Chinese political system.
China has made economic miracle, lifting 800 million people out of extreme poverty. China made breakthrough technologies such as DeepSeek, have their own space station. Basically, China's improvement in the past 40 years is a miracle on many levels. If the system really, like some Western politicians, media said, is doesn't work, it's authoritarian, it's useless, if it's really that bad, can China really make that much improvement? Can China really like improving the living standards of 1.4 billion people? I mean, if that's the basic questions we need to ask. If the Western system is much, 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 much better, is much superior, how come they are not the ones lifting millions, billions of people out of extreme poverty?
So that was really great to have someone who is Chinese born, Chinese bred. She's based in Beijing. She can talk specifically from a Chinese perspective. And then, of course, we had Victor Gao, the vice president of Beijing-based Center for China and Globalization and former translator for Deng Xiaoping. And he's like recently made a lot of headlines because with Trump's tariffs, he's been one of the political commentators that has been making the rounds in terms of interview because he's got some really great sound bites and a lot of fight in him.
China and the United States are not destined for war because war between China and the United States will destroy not only these two countries, but mankind as a whole. Therefore, I came up with my own theory. It's called inevitability of peace between China and the United States, meaning whatever the problems there are between China and the United States, China and the United States need to engage with each other in peace rather than war. And peace, whether you like it or not, between China and the United States is inevitable.
So that was like great to have him on too. What were your highlights this year of guests? I mean, not to play favorites, but.
Well, I think just to stop where you left off there, I think it's been really great to have voices from China because as part of this whole Cold War narrative, where there's this demonization, it's a dehumanization as well of Chinese people. We're talking about 1.4 billion. And so the 1.4 billion people, and the kind of image that you have is that, a society which is brainwashed, there's only one perspective. And, like you say, just very unrealistic ideas. Like, people would have ideas of China being a miserable place where, people are in awful conditions. I mean, this is just so far from the reality of what's been happening over the last 40 years. It's been a massive, massive transformation. I mean, we've both been to China recently and, you're seeing such progress being made all the time. Like we went to a number of cities where we could see with like electric cars and public transport, you're seeing people's living standards going up all the time. And that's like you said, there's an optimism there because people's living standards year on year have just been getting higher and higher in China for the last 40 years. So it's a real transformation. And like often you don't get to hear a voice from China where you're hearing that kind of reality being put forward because, like I say, everything that's said in the West is there's a negative spin. Even, China's transforming itself into an ecological civilization, but at what cost? They criticize the massive steps that have been taken actually to decarbonize the economy. Obviously, a lot more work needs to be done, but that's the case for the whole world. But China is leading the way. So I think it's been really good. And we got into that in the episode with Li Jingjing. And I think, having a voice like Victor Gao, who has been there throughout the whole transformation in China, of the recent transformation with Deng Xiaoping, and like you say, being his interpreter and witnessed that firsthand, just gives you an insight from a kind of high level of Chinese society in terms of the circles he moves in terms of what the perspective is. Because what's really important in a Cold War situation, which is what we're in, is to kind of block out the other perspective. Even if you have hostility towards China, do you want a third world war? And I think that was one of the key messages that Victor Gao said, like, who's going to win out of a third world war? No one. The whole of humanity will probably be annihilated in such a situation. So you might be thinking, you're listening to this, well, this isn't going to happen. Well, there are serious discussions in the US military and political elites that they could win some sort of nuclear war with China. And I think the message that Victor Gao put forward is like, no one's going to win a nuclear war if that takes place. And don't expect a country that has nuclear weapons to not respond. So I think that's the situation of all these kind of risky discussions and kind of trajectory that's taking place. The idea that there would be any winners in a third world war, really, I think is absolutely ludicrous. So I think that was a really powerful episode from that perspective. And I think it's been really important to get those voices, but also then other voices of people who are of Chinese heritage, or people that have been living in China and studying China for a long time. That's been really powerful too. So we had Charles Yu from the Chiao Collective, and we've had Ting Jacks from the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. And they, both gave great insights. Like Ting's gave really great insights on the fight against poverty, all the stuff on actually more kind of a deep dive on the whole issue of how China's been tackling climate change as well. So that was really valuable as well, I think. And I don't know if you want to say more about that one, Ileana, because I know you were really inspired by it as well.
I mean, I've loved all of our interviews really, but that one in particular, because what happened with Ting's Chuck was she wrote for Tricontinental, they did a research dossier on the alleviation of poverty in China, the targeted poverty alleviation project, basically how they lifted the last 80 million people from absolute poverty from 2013. And this project succeeded in the very beginning of 2021. To the end of 2020, China managed to get to zero poverty, zero absolute poverty, on a threshold that's a multi-dimensional threshold. So yes, there's income that is more than the World Bank's income, which is $2.15. This one, China set it at $2.30 per person per day. But then there was also things like food, clothing, 2 assurances, 3 guarantees, food, clothing, housing with water and electricity, free education for 9 years, and free basic medical services. So it's a multi-dimensional approach to poverty. Ting's Chuck did that research on that. So we got to sort of discuss and also understand how they did it, which was an incredible feat. It's an incredible feat that could work anywhere in the world because it's so specific, so thoughtful in their approach. And so she discussed that. But then we also went to Hunan province in China last year to actually look at these villages that were categorized as absolute poverty, suffering from absolute poverty, and to see the change. Like, I mean, obviously we didn't go there when they were poor. We went there to see how and what they did and how they are now. And we went to Shibatong village, which was the village that started the whole targeted poverty alleviation project, where Xi Jinping went there and actually coined the phase targeted poverty alleviation with rural revitalization. So we actually got to see that and hear about the research behind how they did it, see it with our own eyes to see that it does work and how the people are responding to it and how proud they are of their project and how much they worked to get to their status. And that was very moving for me. So I did really love that episode indeed.
Yeah, definitely check that out. We did a report from our trip, and yeah, it was incredibly inspiring. Went to Hunan province, and we obviously went into the countryside, as Ileana said, but we also went into like the cities and new kind of settlements that have been established, really, and seen like just the transformation that has taken place. And whilst you've got this sort of elimination of absolute poverty in the countryside, at the same time, the urban centres have also been advancing a lot, and we just saw cities that had phenomenal green space, these high-speed trains and electric vehicles and stuff. And yeah, it was really inspiring. And in the kind of major cities, you are looking around and seeing, you don't feel like it's a developing country in a sense, because the level of infrastructure is so high quality. I mean, it still is a developing country. China is still a developing country, and obviously there's inequality, that the development that took place wasn't even across the whole country. In the West, there's still a lot of work to do, and that's why the Belt and Road Initiative is so central to bring up those provinces that didn't benefit as much from the reform and opening up, because that was more beneficial to the east of the country because of all of the kind of trading links and stuff that came from that region. So that was really inspiring to see that the progress. And like I say, there are cities where you would compare them to Western Europe or the United States, but sometimes you would actually say this is actually nicer. When you see the journey that China's been on, and where the revolution took place, they were one of the poorest countries in the entire world, and the kind of transformation that's happened over the last 7 or so decades is huge. But at this point, even though there are technological advances in some sectors like telecommunications and the green industry, where the West is actually falling behind. It's not in every single sector, but there are sectors where the West are falling behind China. There's still like an arrogance in the West, which is like, we can't learn from China, they're the enemy. And obviously there's from the elites, a desire to hold that progress back. And there's not enough curiosity, I don't think, amongst the population to learn from what China's doing, even though the things that China are doing, if they were applied to Western societies, would be really beneficial. Like in Britain, we would really benefit from upgrading our rail system to something that moved a lot faster and was a lot cheaper, right? So there's definitely that aspect of things which we're doing with our podcast. But what was really striking to me is when we were speaking to other voices from the global south, be that in Africa or Latin America or other voices in Asia, they are learning from China. The progressive movements are learning from China, whether that be when we spoke to Marco Fernandez from Brazil, or we spoke to people from the African continent. It's very clear that there are lessons that are being drawn from China, because there's also like a line which is pushed forward, even by people who are maybe more positive about China's development, which is like, it's just a one case thing. China is just an extraordinary country. It's huge. It's got its own history. It's its own civilization. And you can't copy anything or learn anything from China. It's just its own case. And I think that is, whilst these might be coming from voices that are positive about China, it's kind of dangerous in a sense, because it's trying to say that there's just some sort of exceptionalism and there's no like lessons that can be learned for all of humanity on how they've done it. And it's not to say there's a blueprint, but there are core features that can be studied and learnt from, and are being in some countries and applied. Like when I visited Venezuela last year, the discussion about China's economic model and how it can take countries in the global south out of poverty, because Venezuela really suffered from US hybrid warfare, economic warfare, and their economy was very vulnerable to that because of their reliance on exporting oil, and a lot of it unprocessed, for example. So one of the things that we learned when we were in China is they don't just take raw materials out and export it to global markets. In the countryside, for example, there was a real emphasis on industrialization, creating value-added products, which then you make more money from, and it creates an economy in the countryside which is sustainable and can improve people's lives. And these are the sort of lessons that could be transferred to many countries in the global south. And there are countries that are learning from that. For example, Bolivia have been doing that with their lithium industry. Like they've been not just exporting lithium out, to the US for Tesla to take it over, but they've been producing batteries, trying to produce electric cars. So that's sort of one of the things that China has done, like in a really model way, is not just export raw materials to the global market. They've built industry, and that's been the foundation for their development. And I think that's really important. And like I say, the West at the moment is trying to, the task is really to get people to see that China's not an enemy, and we shouldn't be going to war with China. We shouldn't be having a Cold War with China. But I think the discussion in the global south is different amongst progressive forces, which is, what can be learned from China in terms of how did they bring all these people out of poverty? What lessons can there be in that international fight? So I think that's been a really striking thing in our podcast that I think we should definitely be exploring more over the next year, like from voices in the global south, like what is it that tangibly people are learning from China in this situation?
Yeah, I think Radhika Desai, the geopolitical economist, Radhika Desai that we interviewed, she talked about China as a productive economy versus the US and the West being financialized debt economy.
You hear other people say that the US was once hegemonic but is now in decline. But you've probably never heard people say that the US was never hegemonic. And that's what I argued in that book. And that what looks like US hegemony is actually a series of attempts to make it look as though US hegemony is working, but it's a lot of bluff and bluster.
And that is, I think, to your point, what these other countries are trying to replicate, but also trying to do. And the differences with China and the US or Western imperialism is that China is really giving a genuine alternative to Western imperialist colonial models of extraction of wealth. And I think that they believe in a sort of different type of, it's the whole when the tide rises, it lifts all boats. And so there's more of a willingness to share technology, to share skills, to work with different countries in different ways. Whereas the US or the West is all about like IP and keeping your IP. And there's a big discussion right now from, JD Vance and the Trump admin about how JD Vance has basically called the Chinese peasants and this idea that they were always meant to just be cheap labor and basically not upskill. They're supposed to know their place, basically. And China has a completely different approach. So I think that is very positive and optimistic for the world. And I personally would love to delve into this idea of IP and copyright and who owns our technology and progress, innovation, etc., more in the next year. So hopefully we'll get a chance to do that.
Well, just one thing you just said then about how the US would like to see China, not remain, because I think they've broken out of this anyway, but the idea that, they want to keep this global stuff down, and the role that racism really plays in all of that. And I think that's why we actually started with our first guest of the podcast was Margaret Kimberley from Black Alliance for Peace, because we wanted to really strike a very clear tone of how we're anti-imperialist, but also anti-racist and feminist. So that was a really great start. Right. And I mean, it's also the case that we've had quite a lot of voices, because we can look around in the global north and see, the political system in general, there's bipartisan support for war drives, but there are voices in that speaking out. And there are organizations too. So we've been in the global north, we've been really, really honored to have guests from, the Black Alliance for Peace, which is a US based peace organization. We've also had the national co-director of Code Pink, which is a feminist movement in the United States for peace. Veterans for Peace, another Matt Ho joined us from Veterans for Peace in the US. And we've also had Kate Hudson from the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, which has been a powerhouse of campaigning for peace in Britain since the 1950s and was key to the movement against the war in Iraq, for example. And so we kind of delved in with all of these people. The kind of key question is how can we, revitalize an anti-war movement today to kind of face up to the challenges that we're facing, which seem pretty unprecedented in a sense, because okay, we have faced world wars before, because what we're talking about is a potential third world war. There has been a first and a second. That's why we're up to the third. But just also the difference here is that there isn't an inter-imperialist rivalry taking place. It's a different kind of situation. And how do we, mobilize people within the global north, within aggressor countries, essentially, to oppose this trajectory towards the Third World War has been really interesting. And obviously we're in an era right now where there's a new McCarthyism, witch hunts, attempt to silence movements, and it's making it really difficult to build a kind of base in the global north against this. But we've definitely been exploring how with key voices from these organizations that are doing their best to kind of build something.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up Margaret Kimberley again, because you're right. It was just such a great episode to start with. Also because Black Alliance for Peace, the Black Agenda report, it doesn't decontextualize racism, feminism, the class struggle. That's the key thing, I think. And that's why we had Professor Catherine Liu on. She talks about how, the virtue hoarders, her dossiers about basically how identity politics can be used by the professional managerial class to stop progress, essentially.
Trump's imperialist attitude with regard to other nations is gangster imperialism. It's very transactional, like, I'm going to threaten you, I'm going to put up these tariffs, and then we negotiate, we make a deal. It's pure force. Like, I come in with pure force because America is the biggest consumer of the world. It's the wealthiest nation in the world. And he's like, no, we need to throw our weight around. We've gotten bad deals. We're going to need better deals. The liberal form of imperialism is the NGO industry, the non-governmental organization insertion into places of conflict in order to create spheres of American influence within crisis areas with the goal of having American corporate interests being protected or move in afterwards, right?
And the key thing here is that it's like weaponizing feminism by decontextualizing it. And our podcast really, we're feminists, but because we're not decontextualizing it from imperialism, from the class struggle, and how everything is interlinked that way, it therefore cannot be weaponized to justify, say, intervention. Like, we're not going to be like, okay, feminism, do you care about women's rights? Then you should invade Iran, for example. Um, just stuff like that, which is basically what a lot of these imperialist war drive, they use that sort of rhetoric to galvanize the masses and to confuse people about like who is actually the aggressor in the world.
And I think one of the key issues with that this past year or longer now is the genocide taking place against the Palestinians and like having a feminist lens on that. So we've had guests speak about the situation facing women in Gaza, which is often just erased. Well, the experience of Palestinians is being erased systematically, but the way in which this genocide has been disproportionately impacting women has been really important. It's been really, and in that light, it was so good, well, phenomenal really to have Lebanese journalist Gadi Francis joining us. And she gave a very powerful interview around the first anniversary actually of the genocide in around October, I believe, if my memory serving me correctly. We also had Sami Ramadani, who is an Iraqi-born sociologist and anti-war activist and was really involved in the movement against the war in Iraq and is an expert on the region too. And we've also had recently Asa Winstanley from Electronic Intifada, who's had his own colleagues within Gaza be killed. And obviously there's been a witch hunt also against Electronic Intifada. So that's been really important, obviously, to be getting perspectives from the region on what's happening in Gaza and its kind of consequences for the Palestinian people, the region and the whole world. And obviously the situation we're facing there is totally horrifying. And, it's been important to kind of locate that within, the international context. Like, why is this happening? And one of the things that I've definitely thought from the start is that, well, first of all, let's just get one thing straight. When people just call things an Israeli genocide, it's not an Israeli genocide, it's a US Israeli genocide and supported by junior partners of the United States, Britain, countries in Europe, imperialist countries in Europe, because Israel wouldn't be able to do this without the support of the United States, totally 100% reliant on the support of the United States. And so you have to say, whilst there's been an attempt in the media to constantly confuse people to think that there's some big differences, none of this would happen without the support of the United States. Like, none of it would happen. It would be over because there wouldn't be weapons going in every single week to Israel and all the aid that happens as well. And then all of the military technical support, etc. The list goes on. The surveillance flights that Britain has been flying over to support Israel's intelligence. So one of the key things that we have explored is, why is this happening? Why is the United States allowing Israel to unleash a level of violence against the Palestinians that has not been seen before? And I think the overall picture of we're in an era of imperialist decline or stagnation and decline and relative decline, where you see the rise of the global south, the rise of China. And that's been one of the key motivations for the United States, where it's seeing failures in other areas, like failure to compete with China economically, failure to defeat Russia militarily in Ukraine, other failures like that. Well, these are massive failures. The fact that China is outcompeting the United States economically, on track to be the world's biggest economy, already the world's biggest economy by some metrics. Again, not being able to defeat Russia militarily. These are huge defeats for the United States. And potentially world-changing events. I mean, Ileana's been talking about a multipolar world, or a world which isn't just dominated by the United States, where there's a global dictatorship, essentially, when it comes to international affairs. And I think that in response to that, the United States has wanted to sort of demonstrate its power And obviously, the Palestinians besieged, being starved to death, are a different kind of opponent than, Russia, for example. So they've sort of seen that as an easier win in a certain sense to kind of inflict a defeat on the global south. So that's why I think they wanted to sort of show their military might, because I think the US is still the most powerful military in the world by a long, long way. And many, many countries in the world, they have the military power to overpower countries. They don't have the military power to overpower Russia. They don't have the power to overpower China, but many, many countries in the global south, they do. And they've used their military power to kind of send a message to the global south, I think, which is, don't mess around with us. And I think that's the kind of international kind of implications of it. They wanted to sort of, in a context of decline, show that they're a very dangerous force to be messing with. So I think that's obviously diabolical, but the kind of truth of the situation, I think.
Yeah, I think you're right. There's a lot of confusion about that. Like, as in, why would, for example, our show, which is staunchly anti-imperialist, why would we care so much about Palestine? It's because it clearly fits into that paradigm. And like you said, this idea of like Israel is actually going against the UK and the US. There are self-interested actors within that, sure. But can they actually go up against the US and the UK? I mean, the US empire, essentially, which the UK is part of? Obviously not, right? Like, to your point. So, yeah. And there's definitely that. There's that. But there's also the idea of just like, there's just more belligerence, isn't there, as the empire is declining. So there will be more erratic moves. And we're kind of seeing that with Trump. I think Trump has been a big topic this year. I mean, I guess he's always a big topic, but this year, we started the year off with Trump's return. We've had several episodes since then focusing on Trump, obviously. How do you feel about Trump right now? You feel about Trump the same way you did probably before, but
yeah, I mean, I think that there were people that, from a progressive point of view, that had some even illusions in Trump, but I think those are getting shattered in terms of
yeah.
his agenda, his warmongering agenda. I think unfortunately, the situation with the United States is like whoever is in power right now, there's a belligerence, as we've been discussing. So yeah, I mean, do you have any thoughts, Ileana?
But I mean, I think he's actually surpassed my expectations, to be honest. Catherine Liu described the way his imperialism as an overt imperialism, as gangster imperialism, which I think is really, first of all, he's so obvious in his imperialism. It has given an opportunity for maybe alliances outside of the US to strengthen, ties to strengthen in Southeast Asia because of its tariffs. I mean, the effect of what Trump has done in the last few months has probably accelerated what is inevitable, which is a multipolar world. Like, I think he's showing acceleration and a sort of a decline of the US in a way. So that was something that was sort of predicted before. And to your point, some leftists viewed his return in a favorable, possibly favorable light. But just to be clear, it was never going to be favorable for the US. I don't think that was the analysis that Trump would be favorable for the US, but more like favorable in terms of an accelerational sort of point of view. Because he's so obvious, it's harder for even the EU or the UK to really cover what they're doing when they align with Trump. So there's that area. And so in that area, he's been useful, but it's so destructive what he's done. He's been useful in uncovering the different dynamics, I guess, a power shift.
But yeah, I think the polarization in the world does continue, though, like with the kind of global north wanting to suppress the global south being like the main dynamic. And I think one of the issues is beyond the personalities, what Trump represents is quite a far right kind of iteration of US imperialism. Like there was no question that US imperialism was going to win the US election, but we've got a far right iteration, which, combines aggression internationally with even heightened aggression at home as well, I think, and the attacks on oppressed communities and stuff. And I think we're seeing that that's not going to just be confined to the United States. This is something which has been growing in Europe, is growing in Britain too. We're seeing the rise of Reform, far-right organisation in Britain. So I think it's not just about the personalities or anything like that. These are social forces. And we're seeing, as things are declining in the West, there is a lack of progressive or left forces that are gaining any traction. They're actually being attacked quite a lot. And so what's growing as an alternative to, let's say, quite right-wing mainstream imperialism is far-right imperialism. That's kind of just dragging the whole Overton window to the right. So things that are like, were seen as really outrageous even a decade ago are just becoming more and more normalized. And I think the agenda of, climate change denial, racism, sexism, transphobia, homophobia, obviously the warmongering, it's all getting packaged together. And I think we're going to see more and more phenomena of that in the global north as a response to the rise of the global south and the kind of crisis within imperialist countries themselves. So obviously that's a gloomy picture, but
I mean, it's a gloomy picture for us.
Yeah, obviously, yeah, gloomy picture. Yeah.
Yeah, in the global north.
We hope for people to kind of see through that and to build movements and stuff. But I think also, obviously, whilst, like you're saying, the image of the United States declines and the awareness of what's happening rises, obviously, it's still the case that the US is very playing a very threatening role because they do have real power. So it is also a challenge for the global south. It's not the case, but like you say, there's an issue of it can potentially raise consciousness and build unity among global south countries. But I think it's still all the same very dangerous. It could be just because of the power that the US has, although it is declining.
Yeah, although it is declining, it's definitely the minorities that are oppressed in the United States will be suffering. They have like record deportations and ICE crackdowns and pro-Palestine activists being attacked and deported, etc. Yeah, it's a very dangerous time. I think, though, maybe the optimistic side of it is, like I said, there are people in Asia that are much more optimistic that they can seize the opportunity that the US is sort of giving them to strengthen their ties, to seek to be more independent from the US. And that has really, I think, been happening in the past few months. So that's a positive sign. It's almost an inevitable sign, but it's just been accelerated. We're not living in Asia though, so that's the part that's not optimistic for us, I suppose.
Yeah, and I guess it's also, I think Asia is probably the region of the world that is moving forward the most. Whereas, like, there's definitely the case in Latin America where things have been very, very difficult. And obviously, we saw huge advances in the 2000s of the left, and things have been a lot more complicated in recent years as the US offensive and the consequences of the global economic crisis have kind of played out as well. So I think it's not like a straightforward picture, but I think that obviously there are opportunities, like you say. And the gloomiest picture, I would say, in terms of trajectory would be in the global north. But I think that obviously a lot of struggles taking place in the global south too. But as you're saying, like, I think the place where there's the most sort of stability and growth is in Asia, but that's exactly what the US is aiming to disrupt, and I think that's when you see it in that way, like they don't have an agenda to make things more peaceful and stable. They want to disrupt that trajectory. And so they use issues like stirring up tensions in the South China Sea, trying to make Taiwan the next Ukraine. All of this is an agenda to disrupt what is not a perfect situation, but it is a trajectory of peace and stability. The US want to get in there and turn the tables on that. And I think there is just no clarity on that in the anyone who's reading mainstream Western media wouldn't see it in that way. But that is, like you're saying, that's how most people in that region would look at it.
Yeah, and that's actually why our most viewed clip ever was about Taiwan. It was a clip of talking about the almost 100,000 strong protest in Taiwan that wasn't covered by the mainstream media in the West at all, because it doesn't fall into the narrative that the US is trying to push, which is Taiwan is a democratic alternative to China and wants to be independent, etc. So, and that was our highest viewed ever with Shang Yu. We talked to Taiwanese Marxist rapper Shang Yu about that. So yeah, and it's because there's, like you said, there's a genuine thirst, I think, for what's really going on in that region between Taiwan and the Philippines. There's sort of like debate on which one will be used as the next Ukraine. And it looks like it might be the Philippines, but but yeah, we've covered both. I think that's, again, we're going to be covering more of that in the coming year because it is going to escalate. The US is determined to escalate in that region.
So just moving on to another region then, Ileana, that we've covered, just to finish up on, is Africa. We've had a number of voices from Africa and commentators on the African continent and the struggles that have been taking place there. So I don't know if you want to share anything you've learned from the podcast and speaking to and who we've spoken to. Could you remind our audience who our guests have been?
Well, we spoke to Eugene Perrier, who from Breakthrough News, who we actually had 2 episodes with. He's based in New York, so he talked about the US as well, but he also talked about anti-neocolonial movements in Africa. There's definitely, I think, an optimism there, especially with Burkina Faso's Ibrahim Traore. I'm not saying that right, I'm sure. But yeah, so there's definitely something that is very optimistic coming out of Africa, the African continent with the Sahel alliances. And we also had Ashlyn Ajembo on recently, actually, who is from Kenya and part of the Communist Party Marxist Kenya and member of the Polytechnic International Editorial Board. Ajembo Ashlyn.
I think at the moment, Africa is breathing life to a new world from the anti-colonial struggles of the mid-20th century to the sanctioned socialist experiments in countries such as Ghana, Guinea-Bissau, Tanzania, Mozambique, Angola. We have witnessed that the objective basis for socialism has long existed amidst the imperial super exploitation of our people.
She also talked about the optimism and the long history of socialism and communism and a revolutionary spirit that has been absolutely decimated by colonial forces, but is very much still alive. But she talked about, again, it's a very precarious time because as Ibrahim Traore is being celebrated by anti-imperialist movements, the danger that he's facing is very real. And Eugene also talked about that too. But that's something that we would like to cover more of in the coming year as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the key things that we learned from the discussion we were having around poverty is it still remains the case that the African continent is the poorest region in the world. And, there are growing links and trade links actually with China. And there's this whole line around China as an imperialist force in Africa, which has been one of the key things that we've asked our guests about to debunk. And is this true? Because, it's just an absurdity because when you looked at the role of the West in Africa and how much development took place, not a lot, when the West played a huge role in underdeveloping Africa, whereas when China's coming in and making deals, railways are getting built, roads are getting built, infrastructure is getting built. And so that is actually changing the situation in quite a positive direction. Obviously, there's a lot more work to do, but I think the voices that we've spoken to have been really clear that there's a huge difference between the West's approach in Africa and China's approach in Africa. The latter being, in terms of China, win-win cooperation. And that's not to say that it's a perfect situation. Nothing is. But win-lose is very different to win-win, if that's what your starting point is, in terms of the West wants to have a very extractivist, dominating agenda, whereas China, I think, very genuinely wants to have a win-win cooperative one where there's benefits for both parties. And I think that's something we've learned from the podcast, speaking to people. And I think it's a very under sort of discussed topic, really. But one of our great guests actually was Roger Mackenzie as well, who's written a book about anti-racism in Africa. And, if you check out his episode, he's got things to say about this as well.
All of these countries coming together, the question is, what brings them together? And what brings them together is to say, we are not prepared to be told what to do, who to talk to, who to trade with, who to have friendly relations with anymore. We will decide that, and stop with your lies about what sovereignty means. So the West talks so much about sovereignty for Ukraine and sovereignty for anybody who's their mates. But anybody who decides to stand up for themselves, their sovereignty is straight out the window. And the United States and their posse seem to think that they can just interfere in anybody's democratic business that they want to. And I think people have had enough of that.
And just about also the point of just the arrogance of, Western media, Western politics, trying to tell the African people who their leaders should be and who they should be trading with internationally. And I think that's one of the key themes of our podcast, is sort of supporting voices for sovereignty and independence. And obviously that trend really, I think, is what Ileana was talking about. That trend of the fight for sovereignty and independence is what's growing in Africa, in the same way that was the key thing that was growing in Latin America in the early 2000s. We're seeing a sort of similar trend developing, I think.
And also just to expand a little bit on your point about like things are not perfect and stuff, I think one of the points that Eugene really put forth, which I think is so important, the context of political infrastructure as well as just like actual infrastructure of a country, the way that it's being governed. These are like legacies also of colonialism. So when a new force like China comes into different countries in the continent of Africa, really depending on where the government is, that is so important as to guide how the investment in their country is used and how it grows, etc. So I think that's really important to have the people that understand the region more, to understand like the different nuances between country to country and the reasons why something might work better in one country in terms of their relationship with China. It's not necessarily because it's China dictating the terms, but the countries themselves in Africa and where they are in terms of their own
Development.
sovereignty, yeah, and development. So I think those insights were really important.
Well, just to add it into that, I mean, yeah, that's part of also China's doctrine, right? Because they have win-win, but they also have respecting whoever the leadership of a country is, right? So they're not going to interfere in that. So if you've got a neoliberal government, they're not going to interfere with the neoliberal policies that that government has, even though China has a very strong anti-neoliberal agenda, have a socialist, progressive economic policy. And so you can see that also not just in Africa, but in Latin America, when countries with a progressive or a socialist leadership strike deals with China, if you take, for example, Bolivia ends up owning the industries that they're getting investment from China, but there's ownership from the Bolivian state of their lithium industries, right? Whereas China can't do anything about the fact that if Bolsonaro wants to sell off and privatize sections of the Brazilian economy, China buying that up, for example, that would be like a concrete example in Latin America. It's like, well, China's not controlling the agenda of the Brazilian government. So people could criticize China for that, but it's just like they have a kind of approach of trading and doing win-win deals with whatever country. But obviously the character of those governments and leaderships of those countries does have a huge impact, as Ileana was saying. And so that applies also to Africa. So I think, yeah, that's an really important part of the picture. But that point about like non-interference, which often is very misrepresented, like the idea that China is meddling and is imperialist. Well, no, that they're not, but then they're also not imposing their model and their system on countries. So
Yeah, and it works conversely too. Like we had John Paban on, the sustainability expert and author of The Great Greenwashing, and he worked in Shanghai for 11 years, visiting different factories, etc. And one of the things that he said that really struck me was that these big corporations like Nestle, etc., they had to change their way of approaching things. Like obviously we look at Nestle and corporations like that, and we can definitely look at their historical abuses of like environmental, etc., stuff like that. And so basically John was saying that in China, because their regulations are so stringent and so specific, these companies actually have to change in order to do business in China. So it's basically the same idea, but converse. They expect companies that come into China to adhere to their regulations and their labor laws, etc. And when their companies go into other countries, they have to adhere to the country's laws.
So with China, they've been able to write and to turn around this massive battleship in the water, the battleship being, environmental pollution, in a more positive way. Is it perfect? No, of course it's not perfect. It's never going to be perfect, but they're doing a lot more than a lot of other places. So when it comes to investment in green technologies and innovation, they put in more every year than the entire European Union combined. When it comes to installing renewable energy sources, whether that's wind or solar, they're doing more than any other country by a large margin. These are the sort of things that can only happen in China because of the scale of the country, but that's helping to not only improve what's happening within China, but helping to improve everything around the world.
So I think that was an interesting episode, I think, from John Pavan, because it shows, like, first of all, that the greenwashing is not as prevalent in China. So when we say that they are leading in green energy, they're actually making tangible progress in that arena. They actually don't do as much greenwashing as the rest of the world, and they can actually lead the way, I think, in terms of climate issues and climate justice.
absolutely. Well, I mean, I think we've kind of covered a lot of ground here today, but there's so much more to come. But I would just like to say thank you to everyone listening to this for your support over the past year. Please, if you like what we're saying, what our message is, and I've really enjoyed our guests, do give us a donation, because this can't happen, without resources. And obviously we're providing an important voice against the kind of mainstream war drive, essentially. So, really thank you very much. And the links are below in terms of how you can support us.
Thank you, and see you next week. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.